Contracts are never needed for happy paths. They're needed for sad paths.
The retention was tied to the end of the warranty period, and the warranty period was like 36 months.
Right. The only thing that keeps me up at night is the questions I don't even know to ask.
My company, I don't want to pay the tuition more than once.
Someone said once, like, the only free thing in construction is saying no.
I'm excited for this conversation for a few different reasons. I think one, I think a lot of things that we complain on the show and stuff that we maybe talk about in conferences, I think we're learning are downstream of documents that were maybe configured and authored before a lot of us kind of got mobilized on the project, right? And so when I was a PM, my brain was focused on project level and down, right? And it was there wasn't a ton of deep contract review. Fortunately, I had a corporate structure that protected me from being able to get into too much trouble. But I was focused on budget, scope, and navigating field dynamics. And, now I've got you two. So Andrew, you're coming at this from the specialty contractor and prefab side with also just a very diverse kind of set of experiences. And then Justin, you're building a tool that at once was really aimed at kind of helping contractors kind of build smarter proposals, but now is kind of growing into arming them with intelligence across kind of the whole process that we'll get into. But Andrew, maybe just to start, hearing my assessment of myself, was I the problem, or is that just kind of every PM in the industry?
Well, I think it's a lot of PMs. One reason could be just training.
Yeah.
Right? What do you know what to even look for? The depth of the current baccalaureate degree, whether it be construction management, architecture, or engineering specific, looking at construction you may get one semester of construction law, but that is very superficial. And two, I think while I'm not a lawyer, I think the legal community continues to leverage their creativity in ways to use grammar, language, and hide things in places that make it more difficult. And so
lawyers,
so the risk profile projects, I think, over my career has changed dramatically, right? And so I think it's interesting and both applicable. There are people at FMI that'll say take your 2 worst jobs or your 4 worst jobs off of your financials for the year, and what does it look like, right? It's significantly different. So you don't necessarily have to be 100% on risk, but I think a lot of people use hope as a strategy. And while I think that there's space for hope in one's life, I don't think it's a solid business strategy specific as it relates to risk. And I'm shocked back in the first part of my career when I worked for a very large national prime contractor, when I'd have to talk to subs about, hey, you're not really performing. And I would point out hey, you signed this contract. They would say, well, I didn't read it except for just looking at what the dollar amount was and that the scope was right. And I'm like, well, you agreed to 12 pages of 0.9 font and a whole lot of things that now I can do. So how about we just finish? Just get it done, and then we don't have to talk about this, right? And I think that's not, there's probably a strata of the contracting community who just is okay with nothing's ever bad happened, so nothing probably will happen. Mm-hmm. I think there's another strata of the contracting community, and these are employees too, hey, it's only a $50,000 job. How bad could it be? Right? The risk is nowhere near proportionate all the time to the revenue. And then you have other well-meaning people who are just I don't have time to read all that. Justin and I have talked about a job that, because I'm certainly not infallible, where I missed some key things that came back later, but it was 10,000 pages of documents, right? So there's no time. I read fast, but I also have other responsibilities, right? So what I thought was interesting is while testing his product, I gave him that, and it happened to find those items that I never even would have looked for because I had no idea somebody would take that as a position. And essentially, Stephen, the retention was tied to the end of the warranty period, and the warranty period was 36 months. And so, that becomes, from a cash flow standpoint on a subcontractor, right? We're already, in many of these delivery models and projects, we're financing the job effectively, right? But now we're doing it even longer. And that sort of finance cost, had you known about it up front, you may say, well, I don't want to bid this job, or, well, 10% of this job for 36 months at an annual rate of some number, I got to add this to it because it's really going to cost me money.
Yeah. I think interestingly, that warranty period was an evergreen warranty, which I had never seen in person as well. So then you have to take that into consideration. And even more interesting is that the item that you're talking about is written as it's a retainage is a year after substantial completion. But then another document, well down the, like very far away, says, unless it's this type of project with this person. And then these terms apply. So if you think about the speed at which all of this is moving in your daily life, and you have documents upon documents that are certain things are overriding other elements of documents, how are you supposed to keep up with that? Assuming you're looking at one project this week, maybe, not 5 or 10.
I mean, don't you kind of assume that like some of the lawyers that write some of these clauses are kind of like giggling to each other in their break room? Like, you cannot imagine what I just wrote on this contract and got through.
I think there's some of that, or at least on the golf course. But I would also say, Stephen, I believe everybody's talking about how AI is being used. I think unquestionably AI is being used on what I would say the other side of the table to make it even more difficult. And Justin's product and solution looks at more than just the contract, but the contract provides a lot of context, right, about how this deal is going to be done. And albeit somewhat pessimistic, I have a general belief that most contracts are written under the context or the perception of what happens when things fail. There's very few or very small portion of the contract that's dedicated to, if this contractor does a fabulous job, then this happens, right?
Yeah. Contracts are never needed for happy paths. They're needed for sad paths.
Yeah.
So I have a friend who was at a general contractor. He was the general counsel there. He's in private practice, and he now he sees his own language in contracts coming back, and the way that he would write things. I mean, he's very talented, and he's very specific about things. And he said, I only had to use that contract when we couldn't come to an agreement on how we were going to resolve issues. And I think this is a trend. I mean, you talked about this on the podcast before with guests about, we used to look at each other and say, all right, here's a problem. Let's solve this together, collectively. And when the generic trend, I mean, this is all anecdotal. Andrew was referring, if you think there's that has changed in the last 1 to 5 to 10 years, we all sound like old men back in my day. We used to just fix problems together.
That's right.
But he would use that just for the purpose of, if we can't solve this together. And I think there's a number of gradients of how people approach this. But if your job as a construction attorney is to write a contract that is favorable to your client, and that is your job, and that is your purview into your role in the project, you're going to write it in case the sad path happens. And you're going to do it probably in a way that doesn't seem that onerous. And certainly, if you don't read long enough, you're going to wind up in a place. You're going to wind up in a place that you've ignored the notwithstanding anything to the contrary X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, and Justin, I think you make a point, about your friend saying like the contract is when we can't work it out together. And while I think most subcontractors could say that they can enjoy a positive relationship or two, but the totality of one's book of business being with firms that they have that sort of relationship with, or those firms are willing to have the types of discussions to resolve issues that normally come through the due course of construction. I guess I'm using a lot of words to say, I don't think everybody's capable or blessed with the entirety of their book of business. They're not dealing with somebody that they don't always deal with. So when that comes to be the play, you have to take a more, I think, cautionary or raise your level of awareness about what's it going to be like, because I can't call the CEO of that company and say, hey, we need to meet for coffee because we have this thing we got to fix.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, which is I think everyone's being stretched beyond their borders, beyond their regions, right, because of the growth in the industry. And so if we used to lean on the social contract and now we don't really know and don't have maybe that social context to help us, Now we're looking at, how do we create the context and insights for us to navigate what maybe our kind of human instinct would allow us to navigate in person. All right, sponsor break. Lars, real quick, when was the last time you got a new set of drawings from an architect and they didn't cloud anything?
Well, the one that cost me a couple $100,000 was back, I think, in 2017. So, yeah, lesson learned there.
Yeah, so what I like about what Trick Tools is building is they're looking at tools to help kind of remove the mundane from the job site. And I, same as you, every time there was a bulletin or an addendum, I would go back to the designers and ask them to at least highlight or give me a cover letter on the changes. And that was always like pulling like teeth. But Trunk Tools is now automating that. So you get a bulletin come in, it automatically highlights the changes. You don't have to do a thing.
Well, it's also hitting RFIs, right? It's also hitting submittals. And when we think about standardizing ops, right, and providing that, sort of resource to those field operators, what I see it as, it's sort of like this like mentor within the company that structures, standardizes, keeps it moving in the right direction, looks out for risk. And just this last week, I had a QC manager just pass along a submittal to an owner without doing a review because he was too busy, and it was wrong. And the classic owner statement is, did you even review this? Right? So this to me is carte blanche. We absolutely did. And think about getting that first pass before your field manager ever even actually has to do the first pass. Someone's doing it for them. So to me, it's about speed. It increases accuracy and helps standardize ops out in the field, right?
Yeah, and this is the kind of AI that we've talked about on the podcast, really appreciating, right? Which is looking at ways to elevate the craftsman at the heart of project delivery.
Give me time back so I can be out in the field managing risk, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yep. So, all right, if you're a little curious, check it out, trunktools.com/podcast. And if you mention Construction Conversations, you get a discount.
Discount. Demos are free, and and you guys get a discount. So let's go.
That's right. So what I'm saying is, like, I think what you're kind of working towards building, Justin, is allowing a technology to add a human layer back into our analysis of risk around relationships.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. In the sense that 6 months ago, a year ago, AI is going to replace shops. The heads of major AI companies said, we're using rhetoric like that, and they recently reversed that statement. I've somewhat done a 180 in that AI is used, the A in AI is augmented intelligence. It is meant to augment skill sets, understanding, learning, teaching, seeing things holistically. They're great tools for synthesizing.
Yeah.
And so I think that the role of AI, and Andrew was talking about time, time and capacity is important in a person's daily workflow, if you think about it like this. And so using AI to compress time or give more time to thoughtful insights and thoughtful analysis is something that we are certainly building towards. We are not building anything to replace any type of human being. Part of it is from experience. I'm probably the least qualified person ever to come on your podcast. I did not grow up in construction. My background is process analytics, idle time, active time, cost X, Y, and Z. And I asked the question why a lot. My early clients probably looked at us and said, do you know anything about construction? I would go, not really. But if you keep asking those types of questions, like I was a junior estimator just coming to learn this, I found that you start asking questions and it goes back to this idea of time. Anyone have enough time to do full analysis of their scope, of the project? We've been talking about contracts, but I talk about the 8 arms of the risk octopus, or your existential portfolio of risk, in construction. And there's a lot of things to take into consideration. We're sitting here talking about contracts, there's scope risk, there's non-scope cost drivers, who's handling the dumpsters, We talk about compliance risks, schedule risks, project type risks, casinos, data centers. And then we talk about stakeholder risk, who you're doing business with. Can we work with these people? And so, the idea that AI is going to replace and cover all of that is is absurd. And so, using AI to augment those categories of risk and who you are as a person and what you should care about, I think is really what we sort of drive towards every day.
But and I think that some of the value is it happens at so many of the milestones of an estimate workflow, meaning you have an opportunity that comes in. Sometimes that might sit on the chief estimator's desk or something for a while because they're working on other things. They're like, oh, it's due in 2 weeks. I'll get to it. And then, they'll look at the work scope or whatever. But the breadth of what some of these projects are, things like we've talked about before, may find themselves in curious or unique places, creatively, or let's just say creatively placed. So what I think Justin's tool is capable of doing in stage 1 is you may have things that you say are an absolute no-go, right, Stephen? Any construction company has finite human capital resource in which to procure work. And I would say the minority are probably saying, well, I'm just going to do X amount of dollars a square foot. I did once time hear a heavy road guy say, now this was years ago, $10,000 a page. When we get in a pinch, we count the number of pages of the drawings, and it's 10,000 a page. Again, I don't think that's very smart, but maybe it works for them. My point is Larry can analyze in the context of things that you say are important, an inbound opportunity, and say, hey, these boxes that you say are no-goes, they exist. And so the nice thing is it affords you the ability to triage something, specifically if the ownership or the executive team says, for instance, we will not do a contract that doesn't have a mutual waiver of consequential damages, or we will not do a contract if the LDs exceed this. So before any estimator plows through and starts looking at it and getting emotionally attached to something in there because they now want to win or their competitor's doing it, if you can take a disciplined approach and do that initial analysis with Larry, you can now say, well, what is a good opportunity? Yeah. Because you can only bid so much. So in my mind, why waste time on things that have a lower probability of returning a reasonable profit to risk ratio?
But I think even that takes some strategic thought, which I think he isn't always represented by the masses in terms of how we approach BD in the industry, which is a little bit more Wild West of like, hey, if it's a job, we go after it. But I think that then reflects in how many contractors belly up every year.
Yeah, it's the difference between like net fishing, being a net fisherman and being a sniper.
Right.
I think so many people, in my experience, are bidding with volume.
Yeah.
And the river is constantly flowing. Taking the time and being able to say no, if you put your company in a position like that. Someone said once, like, the only free thing in construction is saying no. And so, like Andrew said, I know we started talking about contracts in this, but I think about the timeline of a project. And so how many people actually look at the contract at go, no go, or bid development? Again, these are all anecdotes. You go through this go, no process, you look at it and you say, do we know these guys? Does it fit our schedule? Have we done work like this before? Great. Brian, start working this through. So you go through this bid development phase and your information state increases the more time you spend with this, and hopefully the uncertainty of what this project is diminishing, right?
Grab dinner with them.
Yeah. And then you get to, they say, Andrew, we'd love to give you this project for this contract for $1 million. And you read it and there's elements of the contract. You go, well, you've missed my, these qualifications, inclusions, extras. You go, Andrew, I'd like to give you this contract right here for $1 million. And so many people are emotionally invested at that point, and they can see work that's right at their fingertips. They go, we'll figure it out later. Right.
That's a good point.
Or the field can figure it out. Andrew and I were talking the other day that, you run across firms that bid things expecting to make $0, and then ops goes and re-estimates and says, how are we going to make figuring out how to make money on that. And I hear those types of things and I go, that makes no sense to me. Coming out of not being from construction, and that's probably what got me curious about all this. I go, you do what now?
Say it again. So let's take a quick break and just get a high level overview of Rhino Docs, and maybe can you weave in where it started versus where it's going would also be interesting.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so we used to do wide berth document management and workflow. Email is the least productivity workflow tool ever. So we would go and we would understand processes. We had like large financial institutions, and as we were building this, and then I ran into a drywaller that does mainly vertical, and he said, "Will you build me a bid management application?" I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I'm going to fill out a form, generate a proposal, give me some lightweight reporting, and then that's it." So I said, "We'll be done in 3 to 4 weeks." The team went after it, and about 2 months later, I said, "Why isn't this out the door?" They said, "Well, multiple GCs, multiple drawing issuances. It's not all done in one sitting. It's just constantly sort of evolving, growing." So we spent probably this is a 2020 maybe ish, just getting really good at consistency of proposal for the purpose of risk. If I gave 15 estimators the same project in the same company, they would all look different. I mean, sometimes different letterhead logos, different ways of representing work. So there's this consistency of how you're representing the work and at what price. And then we just farm a lot of analytics out of the actual proposal. There's a rich data set. Who are you bidding it to? What person there? The amount, et cetera, et cetera. So we did that for, we still do that. That's like the core of what our clients are using. And then we said, well, look, if we're in the business of risk, and we're asking people to be consistent with quals, inclusions and exclusions, and define scope libraries. This is how we represent frame hang tape. This is how we represent a lot of glass and glazing, MEP clients, obviously. How does that information get on the page? Not wanting to tackle takeoff and estimating. That's a very unique animal. We started looking at, because our background was document management, we started looking at these 10,000 page bid packages and said, I wonder what we can pull out of here. And that's what we started doing. Amazon was kind enough to give us a grant and partnered with one of their groups, and we spent 6 months building that, and that's what we call Larry. But the reality of what we're building is, if you think about the criteria like Andrew's retainage criteria, or you think about spending some time with interior metal framing coatings today, interior extruding load bearing and non-load bearing structural elements. There's a lot of information inside of there, and everyone's been burned on something. If we were sitting around having beers, be like, what's the last thing you got burned on? Be like, well, last week, the week before. And if you can capture and institutionalize that tribal knowledge, which is really what we're building. I mean, I would tell you we're building a lessons learned platform. And the ability to quickly capture and insert that into the process in very unique ways. That is our goal. That's why we get out of bed every single day. Like this is an example just because it's fresh, only like 6 hours. We asked someone to send us a project. They sent it to us. It's a famous person's name on a museum. And the entire coding requirements for all the framing is G120. Now, I've never seen that ever. G90 on external, G40, maybe G60 on interior framing. And initially I was like, it must have hallucinated something. We spent a lot of time making sure it doesn't hallucinate. And sure enough, we looked it up, and it's just sitting right there. So if you think about this timeline of construction, you think about we talk about the labor, the labor shortage, you talk about it on your podcast all the time. How do we institutionalize that tribal knowledge of generation leaving, and that's sort of that's
but in the case of your G120 coding, not that I've seen everything but I've not seen that before. So it's like that retainage thing. I wouldn't be looking for it.
Right.
And I think most estimators wouldn't either, but yet it's a cost driver, right? Later, it's going to be an
That's
if
right.
you win the job. Your celebration is going to last until the point you figure out somebody didn't read all the fine print.
Well, and I think also a lot of these GC models rely on like a player coach type of model where you're going and winning work as you're executing work. And
Yeah.
that was certainly my background. And yet what was skipped was like, this is how you estimate work, right? Like I think I told you, Justin, at one point, my first kind of estimate was me going after this project on my old college campus, and I got approval to go after it, but not any direction of like what that actually meant. And so like what I put together was probably super risky, and thank goodness we didn't win it because that would have caused all kinds of problems. But I do think having the power to lean on it on something else to kind of provide some insight into those gaps, because to the point you're making, what do I ask if I don't even know what to ask, right? And
Yeah.
and this can kind of raise that.
Right. The only thing that keeps me up at night is the questions I don't even know to ask. Like, how did you learn to do what you've done? Andrew was born on a drafting table. I mean, he comes from a construction family, right?
Yeah.
But how did you learn to do what you do over time? That, like for you, Stephen, like how?
Oh,
You,
I mean, I think just a series of mistakes. I mean, I think that is the default training manual for the industry. Is like
Right.
you make a mistake, you either get yelled at or you lose money, and you get kind of pulled into the VP's
But,
office, and then you try and do
but
things a
think
little
about
differently.
this, Stephen. I have a client, and I'm stealing this from him, but he would say, in my company, I don't want to pay the tuition more than once,
Yeah,
right? And so, although let's say hypothetically, you and I are working at the same firm, the lessons you're learning on your jobs aren't necessarily the lessons I'm learning on my jobs. And over the last year plus, just talking to Justin about stuff, I regularly ask construction firms, prime contractors, subs, whatever, do you do a job post-mortem or lesson learned? I would say close to 100% said absolutely. And I'm like, okay, then what do you do with it? Well, it's in Word or it's in Access or it's in Excel. And I'm like, does anybody look at it? Well, no, we haven't figured out how to get people to look at it, but we're very diligent about making sure we write it down. So to the point that Justin was making before, as far as the long-term goal,
yeah,
how amazing would that be for continuity of knowledge throughout an organization that would allow the employees to leverage that experiential knowledge, or things that, let's say, even your bonding or insurance companies say, look, you won't be covered for this. That may not trickle all the way down to the estimator. And so you build that in as part of what it's looking for, again, at that early binary go, no go. What are the things that no matter what, you're not going to do this, right? Let's say there's a $20 million umbrella. And these days it's harder to get umbrellas. So maybe some subs can't even get that. So why spend the time, submit a bid, and then have to deal with the problem of you can't get the insurance?
let me ask this question, because I think a little bit of like a race has started around data, and it's there's an enterprise kind of component, there's an individual component, but there is this understanding that AI plus data equals near endless value. And so like at a personal level, like I've become more intentional around what meetings I record, what I do with those recordings, how I manage like Notion to manage like where my kind of digital brain is. And now you have Palantir coming into the industry with its Foundry product, McCarthy partnership. And so now everyone's starting to talk about ontology, like that was a word we have been using for a long time. And then, a lot of people are building knowledge graphs. How, if everyone builds a knowledge graph and everyone has an ontology, how does all of this kind of interact, Justin? And obviously, like, I want to get into your product because I do think it solves for that in a very interesting way with the human at the center. And that isn't always the case with some of these other solutions. But how are you thinking if everyone builds their own knowledge graph and everyone needs access to all the documents to extract knowledge? What does this look like?
in 2018, before we were in construction, we used what you think about as a knowledge graph. We'll get a little techie here, but I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. So there's something called semantic searches, right? A bar is a pub is a bar. LLMs are unbelievable. I mean, it's like, but it used to take a lot of effort to do that. So you've got terminology. Now, why is terminology important? For one, because people represent work differently. I'm talking architects, engineers, and
Ooh, let's keep that in the podcast.
there's my thumbs up.
That's right.
Yeah. So there's different. Let's call it different language. There's different language that's used. That's important. But the other thing interesting about knowledge graphs, and we were using things called graph databases. Justin lives in Chicago. Chicago is in Illinois. It's really inferenced that Justin is in Illinois. Do you remember the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon?
Yeah.
Okay. When you start connecting the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon with inside your company, and to ask the right questions, it will go and find the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon for you. Now, I need to be really clear about something. You have to know the questions to ask. Our platform, and just using an LLM out of the box, you don't just say, "Show me the risk in this."
Yeah.
You have to. Let's go back to something we said earlier. I am all about emulating human-centric workflows. Buildings they will traditionally be built the exact same way, through the same processes, through the same stages, right? But if you think about using a knowledge graph or any type of just let's call it institutional memory, right? And that's how we think about this. You were talking about recording meetings. That's unstructured data. That's just words. Your finance systems have very specific structured data. Your estimating systems have very specific structured data. Everyone wants to snap their fingers and have it all in one big pool and be able to, ask questions, I guess, but they want the answer to pop to the surface. We are closer to being able to do that now than probably we ever have, but it's not magic. It takes discipline of data. In that Palantir example, that company, their client has been probably meticulously curating that data for a decade or more. It allows access. It allows the questions to be answered with greater confidence and easier. When you start doing all of that, you can put something together in a very, very powerful way.
Yeah.
Internal and external data.
Well, and I think what I hear too is that I think if the analog of, we'll call it the knowledge graph, if the analog is the brain of some sort, we all have brains and all of us do something a bit different with them. And so I think there is still this idea of, if you organize the data really well, that's not the end, that's the beginning. And you still have to have a thesis and understanding of what you're trying to solve for.
Yes.
And I think the last part is, even kind of the trio here, you have solicited a relationship with Andrew because Andrew is just a wealth of knowledge and expertise. And now, some of that expertise is now baked into Rhino Docs' kind of perspective on risk, right?
That's right. You said the word thesis. You have to have a thesis on what you're trying to accomplish. Mm-hmm. That is your business model. How does your company go and approach work? What markets are you in? Who are you doing business with? Not all contractors are created equally. So if you understand that and you have this data and you have this understanding internally, you can still build a really good company without any of that. You have to understand your workflows and your position and your risk tolerance and how you approach relationships. And then you can augment that with processes and tech. And I think the point is that you can just get answers faster and quicker.
Yeah.
More informed answers, but you have to make that decision. You have to have a thesis. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think where my head goes is also Andrew, if I was about to crunch through a really critical contract, maybe in a different capacity, I'd probably call you. I'd be like, hey, this is a term I didn't know. You would be my Larry. And so I guess as someone who is a big fan of Rhino Docs and a user, how does someone with your expertise and experience think through what that kind of value equation looks like.
Well, Justin said it early. I think one of the major values from my seat is time, right? Because a lot of times, depending on the size of the organization, the quantity of people that have the experience, education, interest, or capacity to digest this information in a way that you can then summarize and make actionable, let's just say it is limited. It's certainly not the majority within an organization. So, but that in our organization of our size, that is not the totality of my responsibilities. And so I think a lot of people who do that, unless you're in a big firm and you're a general counsel, but even the general counsel is not going to look at the spec, right? They're not going to look for the fact that there is conflicting information within the spec, or that there is items likely missing from the bid scope. And so, Stephen, to answer that question, it provides me time. So to, in 10 minutes, go through 10,000 pages and allow me to read the summary, there's often been times where I'm looking at something because Justin, was driving, so to speak, and I was like, oh, look at that, that's interesting. And he's like, wait, what? What's interesting? And so it's the ability to take and synthesize down information that is like the G120 coding. The capability to find anomalies, and that's my term, not anybody else's, find anomalies to the norm or the benchmark is something I think of great value, because that was something that I would look for. But also, too, the methods in which I was taught to do a contract review, first off, contracts were smaller then. And, I generally say an unmodified consensus doc or AIA, I'll sign. I don't need to, if it's truly unmodified, that's just industry standard. I'm generally okay with it. But it's the proprietary things or the highly modified ones where the other side is getting better at trying to play a game of Where's Waldo. I don't like that, right? And so, to me, this is a counterpoint that also, let's say it goes through go, no go. It provides critical information that you can say to your estimator or your head estimator, hey, here are 4 or 5 things. Make sure that this is contemplated in the preparation of the estimate. And, oh, by the way, it's going to come up in the risk review before we submit. And then downstream, operations team, which you talked about earlier, like, hey, I didn't look at that. You can extract information and say, hey, you're doing this job with some big, bad national contractor who's got notice provisions that are different for every different kind of instance, and they're going to need to get mailed to 4 different individuals in different parts of the country because it's designed for you to likely fail on your notice provision. But here's a 1-page summary, Stephen, as the project manager, that you didn't have to try to peel that out of the 80-page contract because Larry just did that for you. Again, that's the time.
Yeah, right. Andrew, I mean, you're very contract focused. I bet you say no to more jobs than most people do.
I don't know about that.
we have a mutual. There's a job that you said no to, and we have a mutual client that is bidding it. Right now, you said no for a specific reason. They said we'll take a shot at it, and it only had to do with something about cash flow and contracts. So here's my. This is the hot takes, right? There's always hot takes on the podcast, right, Stephen? So what Andrew is talking about, and we didn't start at this end of the spectrum. Andrew is so contract focused, which is good. And what I see, other individuals in the organization have different responsibilities, different timelines, different incentives. You said like the CFO does not care about anything in division 26, 27, right? The estimator, they don't comprehend the legalese half the time. Mm-hmm. Nor should we require them to really understand the mutual waiver of consequential damages and what that means. That is not their role. So you have these different roles in the company as it matures through this bidding life cycle. And what do you expect what's your expectation of them to care about? Mm-hmm. Just, the same way where operations, that I've heard it a little more succinctly, where they go, what did we just win? All right, great. Thank you. What did we just win? What decisions did you make upstream that are going to affect me downstream?
Yeah. The ability, though, I think to, the general summary, when you load in all the information and you tell it to the intelligence to analyze, it'll come back, Stephen, and say, and Justin could probably say this more eloquently than me, but hey, this is a $100,000 building. This is its use type. These are the components of this building. Like, it can take all that information and give you like a high level, and you might look at this and go, well, I don't do jobs like that. I'm not into the data center space by choice. Now, you should probably know before it gets uploaded that it's a data center, but some of the more nuanced things that may be exclusionary, you bubbles up to the top, but then also to that communication piece where operations says, well, what did you win? Here's the summary.
Right.
Right.
And here's decisions we made.
Yeah,
Right.
I mean, I think that's huge. I mean, I think if we look at just the fidelity of information as it goes through the different phases of execution, whether through programming between the designer and the owner, handed off to a GC, there's a lot of loss of information. And then as it goes from kind of pre-con and bidding into project execution, a lot of loss of information. And then at closeout is normally where it all hits a wall. Right. And I think this idea of using a tool that is kind of stitching together those periods of time is really powerful. What does that packaging look like? What does that handoff if I'm the PM and the project was bid and kind of won and use Rhino Docs, what does that look like?
So I'm doing this mental inventory. We have hundreds of criteria. Criteria are extracting different elements of, like, retention probably has about 3 different individual criteria. All of the trades have individual criteria. I've spent lots of time, electrical, mechanical, plumbing, glass and glazing, interior. And so there's so many little nuances in all of it. And I mean, you've been on the other side of projects. Forget AI, Rhino Docs, whatever. What do you want to know? You want to know unusual details. There's an administrative element. Like Andrew mentioned, the notices. That was the first thing we ever looked at together. He said, "Look at that right there." And I said, "What is it? What's interesting about it?" He said, "I used to pay someone, X amount of dollars a year to go through all of the bid packages and figure that out." So, it's never a vacation in operations, especially under tight schedules. What information do you need? I particularly have been, it always catches my eyes about notification requirements of X, Y, and Z, especially 3 days, 5 days. And then if you miss that window, the entire obligation is on you. So you think about administrative elements, you think about in the field elements, you think about decisions that we made in scope and technical elements, you think about the non-scope cost drivers, the compliance of like wage reporting,
even the windows in which you can respond to change order requests, or there's no markup, or there's no anything like that, right? I mean, those are operationalized. The thing is the criteria are sortable, or maybe are grouped in a way that you could toggle it off. So the project manager may not have interest in, and maybe toggle's not the right term, but may not have interest in some of that deep contract language because it's already passed through whatever sort of executive team says, okay, this is acceptable. But what part of that is actionable? What aspects of the spec or the text on the drawings or the work scope, right, could then be actionable? And I think it sifts through a lot of things, but simultaneously it can find conflicts between the specifications, right? Where a specific spec says, oh, go look at this. Or Justin, there was an issue down in Florida, right? Where there was a 3-phase power that was needed, if I remember right, for motors, but there was no 3-phase power on the job. And it said like, hey, this doesn't exist. And it turned into a big claim because that was run through forensically.
Yeah, right.
What's the value of that? One more point. Like you said, I used to have a contracts manager that we paid some number X to go through things and provide kind of a summary and knew, like the banks of the river, of then what I wanted to see in greater detail. Or, okay, we
was
won
his
this.
name Larry, Andrew?
No. I'm not contributing the name to this. Okay. A very capable lady for sure. But she then would also create that summary, like, project manager, here's your things to look out for notice or whatever. but that's one person. When you start getting a
Yeah.
lot of jobs, right, that's a lot of time. And so to be
Right.
able to get that condensed in the matter of minutes, now look at what you can do from an administrative volume standpoint. To Justin's point, it starts and ends with a human, and that critical thinking is certainly part of our industry. But what I would say is unique skill sets to distill that down has limited capability amongst the total populace, I would say. But even too, when we look at what is happening with people retiring or attrition, how do you train that skill set up? Well,
Yeah.
here you have a piece that sits there and provides the second year estimator out of school. Hey, here's a bunch of information that you should know about or think about that you may not even know to look at yet. But the corporation, the senior people have already said, hey, these things are good. And then within Rhino Docs, you can create subject matter experts or panelists. I'm using the wrong term. Justin can fix it. But in my head, the goal is those people who are 5 years out from retirement or less, create a virtual them with their expertise that's going to sit there and look at the inbound jobs with that expertise. Because that superintendent might say, hey, anytime that there's this brand of breaker panel and this type of transformer, we always have a problem. So if that exists, raise your hand. Or, originally when he and I were talking, it was identifying all this risk. And that, yeah, there's a lot of discussion about risk, but flip that, it's on its head. What if 3 criteria that exist, all of a sudden you see and from your data, you make a disproportionate amount of return in the positive? So how do you find that in the chaos to say, well, wait a minute, maybe this isn't my prime client, but when these conditions exist and they just so happen to exist on this, I have a better than reasonable chance to outperform what we think we normally do. So that actual information allows for critical thinking and direction that otherwise is infinitely difficult to do because of limited human capital and moreover just clock time.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So Andrew, you're kind of like a natural teacher, trainer, mentor type. Like how you mentioned one angle. How do you think about using tools like Rhino Docs to help upskill the next generation? Because there is a risk, right, of all of us over leveraging technology, especially the ones. I mean, if you haven't been yelled at and you haven't made the mistakes, if you're always getting the solution, you're going to be lesser in terms of your ability to think critically. But
fair,
I think there is a way to balance it.
Yes, but I think what we can do is we're trying to evaluate that lesser in the context of our historical careers and in the modern definition. But I think if we just look at an estimator, for instance, if we can let an estimator have more time to focus on what can uniquely make them competitive or the nuances of the project that may have a pricing implication versus saying, well, I got to read all the spec and then I got to do the takeoff. Like the more that the technology can do that, yes, you might argue that's a dying art, but those things take away from really diving into the creative part of how you can differentiate your pricing structure from your competitors. And so no different than some of the technologies that are in the field. Just look at like strip drywall screw guns. Why are those good? More time on tool, more screws per day, right? Okay, well, this isn't any different. Let's get more screws per day. What are the meaningful actions of an estimate, of a decision tree getting to the point of even deciding to that, and spend the critical thinking time, the clock time on that.
Yeah, but see, because you were born on a drafting table, that screw example. And you said that, and Stephen and I just sort of looked at you and said, yep, don't know what you're talking about. That makes a lot of sense. Here's an example I was looking at the other day. The senior estimator reads a waterproofing spec, right? Immediately checks the interface with the structural drawings, right? The junior estimator sees a waterproofing spec and prices waterproofing. So now take that 10 different degrees. Same thing goes for PMs. Like same thing goes for all of these skill sets. This is a giant, the way we're building what we're building, we plan on having probably thousands of criteria and pieces of evaluation that happens on every single job, because it's usually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I don't know, 6 things. And then the idea is that we go hand on a platter to say, look at these 10 to 15 things first. This one, by the way, major problem. But Stephen, I think where you're going with this, and this is what Hair Club for Men, not only am I the founder, I'm a client. I did not understand concepts years ago. And I always thought, oh God, I wonder how people estimate. It's amazing to me. It's like, I could never, ever understand it. But some of this tooling that is not giving you the answer, but it is explaining why the answer is really interesting. I'll give you this is a good anecdote that I heard about AI in general. Charlie Thornton, if you wanted to design trusses, there's a book that's like the cheat sheet of trusses with a few hundred different types. And Charlie would go, look, once you can do the math on your own and you can design that truss, I will give you the book. Then you can have the book. Having a deep understanding of how this works, then you can take the shortcut.
Yeah.
And so if you think about how do you learn how to design the truss? How do you learn how to do this very complicated, highly orchestrated, highly evolving piece of work? You make a mistake, you get yelled at, you walk down the hall, you go, Andrew, X, Y, and Z, and then he'll say, well, if you think about this and then this and this, and he'll give you a master class in screws. That's the concept of construction and the way it's always been and the way it will continue to be. And AI just happens to be a tool that can facilitate that learning, facilitate some of that execution. But you have to understand how to build that truss and how to do the calcs on that truss before you can have the book, before you can have the AI. Because if you don't have that understanding, the AI can be incredibly convincing that it is right and it is authoritative.
A point I want to make with a lot of things, like sometimes in medicine, they talk about using something off label. So we've spent a lot of time talking about from the specialty contractor type perspective. But I believe truly that one thing that prime contractors could use this for, they could put their specs and bid scopes through, and it will, much through the perspective of what a sub would look at it, say, here are anomalies, inconsistencies, or challenges. It's a functional way to QA/QC your bid scopes, bid packages, and otherwise through the eyes of what the subs are likely going to use. And I would argue a reasonable percentage to mitigate potential change orders and battles in the future.
Yes, absolutely. So we have general contractors running bid packages through this for the exact reason that Andrew said. It felt like a softball, but it is true. And I had the VP of construction send me a package, and we were going through it, and there was an example in here, and I said, what's going on with this? This is incredibly ambiguous. And he said, that can't be right. He said, we're really good at defining this. And said, well, let's just click on it. And sure enough, we clicked on it where it was exactly written. He said, I'm going to have to go investigate that. Again, sometimes by design, sometimes by accident. But if we're all in the business of building together and solving problems in the field, I mean, how many times are we getting drawings that are completely finished? This is exactly how we're going to build the building. Never. And so if you think of this naturally always being orchestrated, always changing, highly orchestrated, and hopefully not too contentious, how do you use tooling like this up front to say, down the road, we are going to run into X, Y, and Z. Let's solve it now.
Yeah.
Let's solve it now.
Let me ask this question, Justin. So, and obviously AI is a big variable, but what does Rhino Docs look like in 5 years? Like, if we were to blue sky this and think about how AI gets integrated at a project level, how owners start to think through, you're building this knowledge graph, you're enabling the individual, you're building up kind of a lesson learned library that's integrated into bid workflows. Like, what is, and maybe 2 years, 3 years, time frame doesn't really matter, but like, what's the future of Rhino Docs?
So don't expect this place where someone says, I'd like to build a 10-story school and blah blah blah, and through a combination of tooling, you hit the button, you go, here it is, here's the schedule, here's all the conflicts. I think it's too complicated to paint a state like that. But if you think about the constant learnings, I think there will be improvements on the way items are. I mean, Andrew's in prefab, There's robotics. There's probably a whole other episode for you on robotics, or I missed, if you had it, I missed that one. I just think this knowledge transfer and the ability to look at optionality on how something was done before, what worked, what didn't work, how it could be done in the future, and the ability to sort of share this information up and down with greater transparency, I think it frees us up from being less reactive and more proactive in how we are designing, planning, estimating, commissioning. I listened to that episode the other day. I mean, there's all these different variables going into all of this, and I think that we are in the business of trying to streamline that. It's not just our tool. There's a number of other tools that are involved in the life cycle of a project. But I've been in tech a long time, and this is for sure the most interesting moment that I've ever seen in terms of the capability of what the tooling can do. I think the tooling is way beyond the questions and the things we're asking to do with it.
Mm.
I mean, like, it's January, 6 months ago. I don't think even I would have this conversation, and I consider myself kind of not forefront's not even the right word.
Like 4.8 came out in what, like springtime, and that kind of changed some things.
I've personally vibe coded an application with about 8 agents. They sit in my pocket on my computer. They're constantly doing things. They probably sent you an email. 6 months ago, I couldn't even like begin to code something. Yeah. I mean, I used to do it a long time ago, but I didn't really know where to infrastructure systems to start. Now it's made that possible. I think vibe coding can be dangerous. Number one. Again, this is a whole other soapbox that I'm not even going to climb up on right now. But I think it's moving fast. You have to have a thesis. You have to have an understanding of your trust, your business, your risk profile. And if you do that, these tools are great enablers for people. Augmented intelligence, right?
So Andrew, as you use Rhino Docs, and as we all continue on our AI journey, as someone who sits kind of in an executive seat on the specialty contractor side, how do you think about how the use of Rhino Docs and your own internal data strategy align?
Well, I think where I am, we're working on trying to define what that data strategy is, because it's a bit historically fragmented. I do think, though, what this will allow us to do is really provide a historical context on jobs, not only as it relates to what we decided to bid and perhaps have view into why, but it will allow for employees at some point in the future to go back and try to learn from that in a way that you would not be able to do if it was just, hey, here's the PDF of the project manual, here's the sheets or whatever, because who's going to take the time to go try to synthesize that?
No.
It's not going to happen. And
right.
And with the idea of operationalizing lessons learned, which I've told Justin, to me, is the holy grail of this whole thing. Again, everybody I've talked to, they write them down. They don't know how to get everybody to use them. And so there's this whole breadth of knowledge that needs to become actionable. And so as it relates to the data strategy, I'm excited about trying to do that, especially as it relates to how a company can transition from generation to generation, or even deal with unexpected employee departures.
Right, exactly. There's an important point that it's a hill that I would die on with AI, is that you have to put these insights where people are working. That's why the most beautiful curated lessons learned sitting on a network drive or a dedicated internal website, they're just collecting dust. Because if you're not working there and going, gosh, I feel like, or additionally be like, I really feel like I'm screwing something up. This doesn't make sense to me, right? I should really stop what I'm doing because I have tons of time. I'll let these bids and I'm going to go search through the internal knowledge base. But I always get a little like when people start talking about curating data, I have an idea of what it means. It's still very complicated. I bet if you ask most people, what does your data curation strategy look like? And they'll go, what do you mean by that? It's easy. It's easier to think about lessons learned. Lessons learned isn't even captured in a company overnight. It might take a year, and it's ever evolving.
Mm-hmm.
But if you know that the result is going to be next time we talk about not doing something this way, or make sure that we do it this way, is in a place where someone is working and they can see that and make that decision, that's worth investing in my humble opinion.
Yeah, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I know we're running out of time. I want to ask each of you one more question. What's the best piece of advice, personal or professional, either of you have received? So maybe Andrew, you start.
Wow, best piece of advice. I've been given a lot because I've been blessed to have 5 people that I consider are, great mentors. You know what? I think I'm going to go with something that I share with young people that my dad said, and some people might argue this is controversial, but never answer an unasked question.
That's a good one.
Yeah, I do that. That's a good one. I'm gonna incorporate that.
Yeah.
And we'll just say that in the context of one's professional career.
Yeah. I feel like in a marriage I could get sticky, but yeah. Justin, what's yours?
Well, that's pretty good.
Yeah, beat that.
When in doubt, call Andrew Rener.
Yeah, right.
I've had some great mentors too. This is general business advice. There's a book someone gave me called The Go-Getter. And what it is they said, Justin, this book reminds me, you help people with zero expectation in return. Now you say that on a construction podcast and people go, we don't help people with nothing in return. But over my time, I've always tried to be helpful. I'm a pretty naturally curious person. And what I found is it always comes back in some way, shape, or form. And if you think about that in terms of construction and in the spirit of building things together, that attitude and philosophy has gotten me pretty far in life. And I think if more people took of like, let's build this together, I'll help you. And I'm sure you'll help me one day. Maybe the world's a better place, and that's all world peace. I mean, that's what we're going for here.
I like that. I didn't realize we're going to end the episode with just like a John Lennon Imagine sing-along. But no, I mean, I think that's good, Justin, because I think you're right. There is an element, too, of this industry that has an interior culture, which is like we do kind of look out for each other. And I think it's an industry that even from a tech standpoint, when I've been on that side of the fence, whenever if you screw up, it's almost expected. It's how you respond to that. And I don't think many industries are like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. How you recover.
Yeah. Well, Justin, Andrew, thanks for joining. I appreciate you guys hopping on. This is a fun conversation.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.
It's my one day in the future.